December 24th, 1944. 3 a.m. Gleize, Belgium. In the frozen dark, a password moved from man to van through the ruins of a small Belgian village. Merry Christmas. It wasn't a greeting, it was a signal. Whoever heard it knew what came next. Drop a grenade inside your own tank, or set a timed charge, and walk away from a machine you'd trained for years to fight inside of. One by one, find engines that had once carried the most feared armored spearhead in the entire Ardennes offensive went dark for the last time. Within the hour, roughly 800 men of the 1st SS Panzer Division would abandon over 100 vehicles, including 6 Tiger II heavy tanks, each one weighing nearly 70 tons, and walk out of Belgium on foot through enemy-held ground because there was no fuel left to drive them and no way through. 8 days earlier, this same force had been the sharpest weapon Adolf Hitler had left. Its commander was SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, 29 years old, a battle-hardened officer who'd led armor on the Eastern Front, and who had just been handed one of the most important assignments of the entire German offensive. Punch through American lines, seize the bridges over the Meuse River, and open the road to Antwerp. He had roughly 4,800 men, 117 tanks, including 45 King Tigers, and orders to move fast and not look back. What he ran into instead over the next 7 days was a version of the US Army that German intelligence had consistently underestimated for most of the war. Mobile, fast-reacting American armored formations that could reposition, encircle, and choke off a spearhead faster than it could be resupplied. Before I get into exactly how that happened, because the way it happened is honestly more interesting than the headline number of tanks lost. I want to ask you the same thing I ask at the start of every one of these. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. This channel exists because these stories get passed down, and I'd genuinely like to know who's still carrying them. Now, back to the Ardennes. Peiper's column crossed into Belgium in the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944, the opening day of what the Germans called Wacht am Rhein, and what history remembers as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan depended on speed most of all, and speed was exactly what Peiper never got. A destroyed bridge forced an immediate detour before his column had even cleared its own lines. Then came the town of Stavelot, where determined American resistance slowed him for critical hours. Then, Stoumont, where on December 19 his tanks fought a 2-hour battle against an American tank battalion before finally taking the town. A battle that, by the Germans' own timeline, cost them time they didn't have to spare. By December 18, elements of the US 3rd Armored Division, the formation nicknamed Spearhead, had already pushed a task force north of Trois Ponts and cut the road Peiper needed for reinforcement or resupply. It was a quiet, unglamorous move on a map, but it also permanently ended any real chance that the rest of the 1st SS Panzer Division could reach him. Combined with attacks from the US 30th Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne closing in from the north, east, and west, Peiper's column, designed to be an unstoppable armored fist, was, within 4 days of crossing into Belgium, surrounded in a pocket of less than 2 square kilometers around the village of Gleize. An attempt to resupply him by air on the night of December 22 failed almost completely. Roughly 90% of the fuel and ammunition canisters dropped by the Luftwaffe landed outside his shrinking perimeter, some of it falling directly into American hands. A separate attempt to float fuel drums downriver to his position also failed. This is worth sitting with for a moment. One of the most powerful armored task forces in the German order of battle, built around King Tiger tanks that outgunned nearly anything the Americans could put against them directly, was reduced within a week to waiting on a river current to bring it gasoline. By December 23, hardly a building left standing in Gleize was habitable. The Americans had stopped attempting direct infantry assaults into the town. The risk of pushing Sherman tanks into range of Peiper's Tigers in close terrain wasn't worth it, and had instead settled into something colder and more effective. Over 100 artillery pieces and dozens of mortars, pounding the position around the clock, patient enough to let American armor finish the job without firing a shot. Peiper was out of fuel, nearly out of ammunition, and completely out of options. December 21, 1944. Gleize, Belgium. Major Hal McCown, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, had led his men into an attack on Kampfgruppe Peiper's dispersed positions that morning. It failed. His battalion was forced back, and McCown himself was taken prisoner, marched into the cellar of a large house in Gleize that Joachim Peiper had turned into his command post. What happened next is one of the stranger, better documented footnotes of the entire Ardennes campaign, because McCown didn't just sit in a corner as a prisoner. He and Peiper talked for hours. Two men roughly the same age, both commanding battle-hardened combat units, both fully aware that one of them was almost certainly about to lose everything. McCown later wrote an official report on the conversation, and what stayed with him wasn't menace. It was Peiper's confidence, which McCown described as almost total. Peiper spoke at length about new SS reserve divisions forming under Himmler's command, about Germany's continued capacity to fight. McCown would later write that few men had impressed him as quickly as this German officer had, even as his own men were being pounded by artillery a few feet above their heads. That confidence did not survive the next 2 days. On December 22nd, an American shell struck the wall of the cellar directly, throwing one of McCown's 5 German guards halfway across the room and blasting a hole roughly 2.5 feet wide through the stone. Nobody in that cellar, American prisoner or German captor, was under any illusion anymore about who controlled the ground above them. Powerful task forces from both the U.S. 3rd Armored and 30th Infantry Divisions, backed by more than 100 105mm and 155mm guns and 36 medium mortars, hit Peiper's shrinking perimeter on the 22nd and 23rd. Neither assault broke through the German lines outright, but neither one needed to. American commanders had already made the calculation that risking Sherman crews against dug-in King Tigers in tight village terrain wasn't worth it, when artillery alone was strangling the position just as effectively and at a fraction of the cost in American lives. By the 23rd, virtually no building in Gleize remained fully intact. Peiper's men were hungry. Most of his force, McCown noted with something close to disbelief, were 18 or 19 years old, recently drafted replacements, not the veteran cadre that had made the 1st SS Panzer Division's reputation. They had almost no food left, they had almost no fuel, and they had no way out. For late in the day on December 23rd, SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke, Peiper's superior, finally authorized what Peiper had likely known was coming for at least 48 hours. Permission to break out. The terms were brutal in their simplicity. The wounded, German and American alike, would be left behind in the care of medical personnel. The American prisoners, including McCown, would be released, and every vehicle that couldn't move under its own power, which by this point was nearly all of them, would be destroyed where it sat, rather than left intact for American recovery crews. In the early hours of December 24th, a password went out: Merry Christmas. Grenades dropped into hatches. Timed charges set in engine compartments staggered deliberately so the explosions wouldn't announce the retreat all at once. Fightin' King Tiger IIs, 70-ton machines that had rolled into Belgium 8 days earlier as the tip of Hitler's last major offensive in the West, were reduced to smoking wrecks by their own crews rather than face capture. Roughly 800 survivors of a force that had entered Belgium nearly 5,000 strong slipped out of Gleize on foot, moving southeast through terrain still contested by American patrols, hoping to reach German lines before daylight or American fire found them first. McCown was released as agreed, and made his way back to American lines within days, carrying with him one of the more remarkable first-hand accounts of the entire battle. 90 hours inside the command post of the man responsible for one of the most infamous atrocities of the campaign, the killing of American prisoners of war near the town of Malmedy on December 17th, for an event McCown would later testify about at Peiper's 1946 war crimes trial, saying he personally witnessed no mistreatment of prisoners during his own captivity. What was left behind in Gleize told its own story without a single word of testimony needed. For American recovery crews, who moved into the wrecked village in the days that followed, counted more than 100 abandoned German armored vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, armored cars, artillery pieces, sitting exactly where their crews had destroyed them rather than let American armor take them intact. January 1945. The Ardennes aftermath. The Battle of the Bulge didn't end with Kampfgruppe Peiper's retreat from La Gleize. Hitler's offensive still had weeks left to run, and Bastogne, Selles, and the fight to close the Bulge itself were still ahead. But among German officers and post-war military analysts studying what went wrong with the offensive's most critical spearhead, La Gleize became a specific and recurring case study. Not because of any single dramatic quote, but because of what the operational record itself made impossible to deny. Peiper's force had started the offensive with a real material advantage. King Tiger IIs outgunned and out-armored nearly every tank the US Army could put against them head-on. His crews were veterans. His orders came directly from the top of the German war machine, with priority routing and priority fuel allocation on paper. And in 8 days of combat, force that's covered barely more than 40 kilometers before being surrounded, starved of fuel, and reduced to destroying its own equipment rather than let it fall into American hands. The U.S. Army's own official history of the campaign, compiled by historian Hugh M. Cole for the Army's Center of Military History, documents in detail how American units, often outgunned tank for tank, used speed, road network control, and constant repositioning to encircle and strangle Peiper's column. Rather than meet it in a straight fight, it might have won. The 3rd Armored Division's move to cut the road north of Trois-Ponts on December 18th is treated in that history as one of the single most consequential small actions of the entire battle. Not because it destroyed German tanks directly, but because it made resupply and reinforcement impossible for everything that came after. That is, in the most literal operational sense, what unstoppable meant here. Not that American Shermans were better tanks than German Tigers. They generally weren't, gun for gun and armor for armor. What proved unstoppable was the mobility, coordination, and logistics of the American armored divisions as a system. The ability to reposition combat commands faster than the Germans could adjust. To cut a single road and unravel an entire offensive's timetable, and to simply outsupply and outmaneuver a numerically smaller but individually more powerful force until it had no fuel left to fight with at all. Peiper's own order in the early hours of December 24, destroy the equipment, walk out on foot, is as close to a formal admission of that reality as a defeated commander can give without a press conference. You don't torch 6 King Tiger tanks with your own grenades unless you've already concluded, as a matter of fact rather than propaganda, that you cannot win the fight those tanks were built to win. Joachim Peiper survived the war. He was tried at the 1946 Malmedy massacre trial, convicted, and sentenced to death for his role in the killing of American prisoners of war. A sentence later commuted after revelations that some confessions used against defendants in the case had been coerced, for as he served roughly a decade before his eventual release. Major Hal McCown, the American officer who had spent those 90 hours as his prisoner in the La Gleize cellar, testified at that trial that he personally witnessed no mistreatment of prisoners during his own captivity, a small, honest footnote in a case built on much darker events elsewhere. McCown went on to a long career in the U.S. Army, eventually reaching general officer rank, serving in Korea and later in Vietnam, dying in 1999. The village of La Gleize itself still carries the physical evidence of what happened there. One of the King Tiger IIs abandoned in the retreat, nearly 70 tons of steel, engine destroyed by its own crew rather than surrendered intact, sits today outside the December 44 museum in the town square, close to where it was left. Locals and historians still refer to it as the place where, whatever happened at Bastogne to the south, the German offensive in the north effectively died. It's sometimes put simply, if the Americans won the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne, they broke it at La Gleize. What the record shows, when you follow it honestly from December 16th to December 24th, 1944, isn't a single German officer standing up and declaring American tanks unbeatable. It's something more convincing than a quote, a documented day-by-day operational collapse, feistin, ending with a password whispered in the dark, and the deliberate destruction of the very weapons that offensive had been built around. That is what an admission looks like when it's written in abandoned steel instead of ink. If you want more of these real operational history not recycled internet folklore. This channel is going to keep digging through the after-action reports to find them. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and it's exactly what keeps this research going.